She carried her husband everywhere she went. In the boots by the door she couldn't move, in the land she couldn't lose, in the rage she couldn't swallow. He carried 11 men he'd killed, some who'd deserved it, some he wasn't sure about, stacked in his chest like stones, heavy enough to drown him. Two people drowning don't save each other, usually. But Margaret Callahan and Luke Mercer were not usual people, and the Wyoming winter that tried to destroy them turned out to be the thing that finally set them both free. What this story leaves you with is simple and true. The voices that tell you what you are can be silenced. Sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to believe them and loves you loudly enough that you finally start to doubt the lie. Here on this channel, we believe the West's greatest stories aren't about gunfights. If this story touched something in you, subscribe, leave a comment, share it forward. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
The courtroom smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. Margaret Callahan stood straight and tall, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned bone white. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her shake. Judge Hawthorne spoke to his papers instead of to her, as if the law was just ink and not the woman standing before him. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Callahan, the Territorial Property Statute of 1874. The issue is quite clear, he went on. A woman cannot hold the deed to more than 40 acres without the legal authority of a husband or a male guardian. I know what the statute says, Margaret replied, her voice as steady as a stone. She had practiced that very tone in the dark early hours of the morning, while her late husband's boots still sat by the door where he had left them 6 months ago. Then you must understand. I understand that my husband was the sheriff and he died protecting this town, she said. I understand this land was purchased with his hard work and my careful management. So yes, Your Honor, I understand the law. What I fail to understand is why it is being used against the very woman who helped build this community. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. It was the kind of quiet that falls when a woman speaks her mind in a place where she is not expected to. From a back pew, a chair creaked. It was Victor Crowley. He did not need to stand up. Everyone in Red Hollow knew that when Crowley shifted his weight, the entire town felt the tremor. Your Honor, if I may have a word. Crowley's voice was as slick as oil. The Callahan property is 412 acres of prime land right next to the proposed railroad path, Crowley said, directing his words to the judge. Mrs. Callahan, bless her heart, has no foreman and no legal claim to the deed. I have made a fair offer. Twice. Margaret turned to face him, her eyes flashing. You offered me 12 cents an acre for land that is worth $3. That is not a fair offer, Mr. Crowley. That is theft with a handshake. A murmur spread through the gallery of onlookers. Crowley's smile did not falter. I also offered you a respectable position as my housekeeper. You offered me a cage with pretty curtains. I offered you a way to survive, Mrs. Callahan. And I told you no. The judge banged his gavel. That is enough. Mrs. Callahan, this court gives you 14 days to find a male custodian for the property. She is not going to need 14 days. Every head in the room spun around. The large courthouse door stood open, framing a man in the entrance. That man was Luke Mercer. He was tall, not in a loud way, but in a way that simply filled the space he occupied. His hat was pulled down low, and his eyes were cold and empty, the eyes of a man who had seen too much to be bothered by anything anymore. Margaret knew his name before anyone even dared to whisper it. Luke Mercer, someone breathed. The butcher. Crowley's confident smirk finally disappeared. Luke walked down the center aisle, his worn boots making a slow, deliberate sound on the wooden floor. He stopped directly in front of the judge and did not remove his hat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low and rough like a dirt road, "I am here to marry Mrs. Callahan." The room erupted in chaos. Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. Luke paid them no mind. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and placed it on the bench. "The bounty on my head was cleared. This is a full pardon from the territorial governor. I am a free man." Crowley shot to his feet. "This is absurd. You cannot allow her to marry this killer." "I am a free man with legal standing," Luke said, his voice calm and even. "I am offering to take legal guardianship of the Callahan land through marriage. The statute permits it." "The statute does not require her to accept a murderer," Crowley spat. "It does not require her to accept a thief either," Luke answered without missing a beat. "And yet, here you are." A dead silence fell over the room. Judge Hawthorne looked from the pardon to Margaret. "Mrs. Callahan, his documents appear to be legitimate. If you consent to this marriage, the property will remain under your joint guardianship." Margaret looked at Luke Mercer, at the old scar that traced his jawline, and at the immense weight she could see in his eyes. He finally looked directly at her. "Ma'am, I am not asking you to trust me. I am asking you to let me help you keep what is yours." "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this?" A flicker of old pain crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Because your husband asked me to." Margaret felt as if all the air had been pulled from the room. "Daniel, before he died, he sent me a letter. He said if anything ever happened to him, I was to make sure you and the ranch were looked after." "I never saw a letter." "No, ma'am, you would not have. He did not want you to worry." Margaret took a deep, steadying breath. As Crowley began to protest again, Margaret spoke over him, her eyes fixed on the judge. "I consent." The wedding took place 20 minutes later. There were no flowers, no music, just a judge, a Bible, and a courthouse filled with regret. When the judge said they could kiss, neither of them moved. "A handshake will suffice," Margaret stated. Luke extended his hand. His palm was rough and calloused, a hand that had known both hard work and hard fights. "Mrs. Mercer," the judge said. "Callahan," Margaret corrected him. "I will keep my name for the ranch." No one dared to argue. Outside, the July sun was relentless. Luke walked beside her to the wagon, keeping a deliberate 3 feet of distance between them. "I will ride behind you," he said, "and I will sleep in the barn." She stopped and turned to him. "You will sleep in the bunkhouse. There is a cot. The barn is for animals." He studied her for a moment before giving a slow nod. "Yes, ma'am." She climbed into the wagon and took the reins, not waiting for him. During the long ride to the Callahan ranch, one single question burned in her mind. What kind of man agrees to marry a complete stranger just to honor a promise made to a dead man? The first 3 days were defined by a deliberate silence. They did not speak. They worked. Luke was up before sunrise and did not stop until well after sunset, mending what was broken. Fence posts Crowley's men had knocked sideways. He cleared the irrigation ditch that had filled with silt since Daniel passed. The barn door, hanging crooked for months, was set right again. He never asked, just worked. Margaret would wake up to find something fixed. On the 3rd morning, he was at the well, shirtless, hauling water. She saw the scars, a whole mess of them. A history of violence written on his back in raised white lines. Some thin, some thick, all tangled together like a whip had found the same spot over and over. She let out a small gasp. He spun around, a flash of instinct, and their eyes met. She saw shame clear as day, the kind a man feels when a buried part of him is unearthed. He reached for his shirt. "Don't," she said softly. "I mean, you don't have to hide on my account. Whatever caused those, they ain't nothing to be ashamed of." He pulled the shirt on anyway, buttoning it clear to his throat. "With respect, ma'am, you don't know what they are. Then you ought to tell me." He just hefted the water bucket and walked past her. "Not yet," was all he said. She couldn't sleep. The heat was a fist clenched around the house. She sat on the porch watching the dark, a glass of water in her hand turning warm as bath water. Luke came around the house, walking the fence line like he did every night, checking for trouble. He saw her and stopped. "Ma'am, didn't mean to bother you." "You didn't. Have a seat." He hesitated, then sat on the far end of the steps, a good 4 feet of space between them. "My husband never spoke of you," she said. "Not one time in 9 years of marriage." "He wouldn't have." "Why not?" Luke took off his hat. "Because I'm the kind of man a good husband keeps from his wife. Meaning, you did things for the Marshalls that don't belong at a dinner table. Did you do them for Daniel?" There was a long silence. "I tracked a man once. A man who'd killed a family outside Laramie. Daniel couldn't cross the line, so he sent me. And you found him." "I found him. And he didn't make it back, did he?" She let the silence hang in the heavy night air. "What about those men in Silver Creek? The ones they call you a butcher for? They were running women across the border. 2 of them drew on me. The third came at me with a knife." He paused. "I can't say I liked it, but I didn't think twice. Should you have?" He finally gave her a real look, not one of his quick glances. "No, ma'am, I shouldn't have." Margaret nodded. "Daniel chose you for a reason. He knew what I'd be facing." She turned to him. "Victor Crowley ain't gonna quit just because I signed a marriage paper, is he?" Luke put his hat back on. "No, ma'am, he ain't." "So what's next?" "He'll push. Try to break you, the ranch, this arrangement. He wants you so desperate you'll sell. And if I don't?" Luke stood and looked out at the dark prairie. "Then he'll do something worse." "Well, I need to know something, Luke Mercer. When it gets worse, are you going to fight for this land or are you going to vanish?" He turned to face her. "I don't break my promises, ma'am. That's the one thing they got wrong." "What did they get right?" "A long beat. That I'm dangerous." He stepped off the porch and into the night. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, she felt something like hope. Like the first breath of air after you've been held underwater for too long. She went inside and locked the door out of habit, not fear. Out in the bunkhouse, the man they called a butcher laid in the dark, his hand over a letter in his coat. It was from the dead sheriff. It said, "If I don't make it back, you look after Maggie. The wolves will come for her. She'll need someone who knows how to fight 'em." Luke closed his eyes. The wolves were already here. They came on the 7th morning. Margaret found the first dead calf in the south pasture, its belly sliced open by a blade, not by teeth. It was a message. She didn't cry. She just felt a cold hardness settle deep inside her. Luke was suddenly there. He knelt, examined the cut. "Knife," he said. "Happened between midnight and 3. "How can you tell? The blood's dry but ain't black yet." He stood wiping his hand on his jeans. "This wasn't coyotes, ma'am. I know what it wasn't." He looked at her and saw she wasn't breaking. He just nodded. "There'll be more. I know that too. You want me to ride the perimeter? I want you to ride it every night until the coward who did this is found." "Yes, ma'am." By noon, she'd found 2 more. Each one left where she was sure to find it first. This was about making a widow feel helpless. She was at the sink scrubbing her hands when she heard horses, 2 riders kicking up dust down the road. She grabbed the shotgun from over the door and walked outside. One was Tom Avery, Crowley's foreman. The other was just a young hand who looked scared. "Mrs. Mercer," Tom said, tipping his hat like an insult. "It's Callahan," she corrected. "What's your business?" "Mr. Crowley sends his sympathies about your cattle trouble. Predators get mighty bold this time of year. Predators don't carry knives, Tom." Tom's smile never left his face. "Now that's a heavy accusation, ma'am. I've got 3 dead calves and a man on my porch who works for the only one who wants my land. That's proof enough for me. Mr. Crowley's offer still stands, 15 cents an acre. He must think I'm getting desperate, aren't you?" Margaret lifted the shotgun, not aiming, just letting him see it. "You're on my property, Tom. Daniel taught me to shoot when I was 14. You deliver your message, but don't you stand on my land and call me desperate." Tom's smile finally fell. "Where's that husband of yours, Mrs. Mercer?" "The butcher." "None of your business. Seems like it ought to be. A woman all alone out here. Here, all by your lonesome. No hired hands, no lawmen. I said state your business or get to steppin'. Tom took up his reins. 15 cents. You got till the end of the month. He turned his horse, then paused. Oh, and ma'am, you might want to check your water. In this heat, a well can turn foul mighty quick. They rode off, leaving Margaret standing in a cloud of dust. She let her hands shake for just 10 seconds, then stopped them cold. Luke came from behind the barn. He'd been there the whole time, close enough to hear, but far enough to let her handle her own business. You heard? She asked. Every word, he said. He threatened the well. I know. If they poison it, we're finished, Luke. The cattle, the garden, everything. Luke's voice was low and steady. They won't poison it. And how do you know that? Because I'll be watching. Ma'am, this ain't a war. This is just a rich man bullying a woman he thinks is all alone. And bullies got one big weakness. They never expect you to hit back. I'm not asking you to kill for me, Luke. He looked at her straight. And I ain't offering to. What I'm offering, he said, stepping a little closer, is to be the reason Crowley starts sleeping with one eye open. Right now, he's just testing to see if the stories about me are true. I aim to show him they are. But I need you to understand me, ma'am. His gaze was firm. If they come for you in the night, with fire or with guns, I will not hold back. And I will not be sorry for what happens next. Daniel wouldn't have wanted you to kill for me. Daniel asked me to protect you, he said quietly. He never told me how. She looked out at the sun-scorched pasture, at the endless sky that offered no mercy. Fine, she said, her voice tight. But you answer to me, not to whatever ghosts are riding you. You answer to me. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Yes, ma'am. He turned and walked back toward the barn. Margaret thought of Daniel, who used to say the law was a strong fence against the wolves. She knew better now. The wolves were wearing badges and carrying land deeds, and they were tearing that fence down one post at a time. The next morning, Luke was gone before the sun was up. He returned at high noon, his horse covered in sweat. He swung down and came right to her. Crowley's filed a petition in Cheyenne, he said without preamble, challenging our marriage. Margaret's heart went cold. On what grounds? He's claiming my criminal past makes me morally unfit. Says the governor's pardon cleared the sentence, not the record. Morally unfit? That's rich, coming from a man who steals land for a living. Doesn't matter if it's rich, ma'am. It matters if it's legal. If the petition goes through, the marriage is annulled. You lose your claim. The land goes back to the territory, and Crowley scoops it up for pennies on the dollar. That's his play. How long do we have? Petitions take 60 days. But if Crowley has a judge in his pocket, it could be a whole lot faster. We have less than 60 days then. She felt the world closing in. What do we do, Luke? We make the marriage real. She just stared at him. Not like that, he said. And a dark flush rose on his neck, looking strange on a man made of iron and scars. I mean, in public. We go into town. We buy supplies. We eat at the hotel. We let folks see us acting like a married couple. If the town believes it, Crowley's petition looks like what it is, a desperate lie. The town is afraid of you, Luke. That's different from hating me. We just need to change the story they're telling themselves. You want me to stroll through Red Hollow with the man they call the Butcher of Silver Creek? He met her gaze. I want you to keep your land, ma'am. If holding my hand is what it takes, I reckon I can stand it. A laugh almost escaped her, but it died in her throat. He saw it, though, the ghost of a smile, and for a second the hardness around his eyes seemed to crack. Fine, she said. Tomorrow we go to town. Yes, ma'am, and Luke. If anyone in that town calls you a butcher, you let me be the one to answer them. He gave her a long look. Then his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. Yes, ma'am. Riding into town side by side, every eye on Main Street followed them like a hawk tracking a rabbit. The whispers started before they even hitched the wagon. Lord have mercy, she really brought him. Look at the size of him. Poor Margaret. Margaret climbed down, squared her shoulders, and walked into Patterson's general store like she owned it. Luke followed, taking his hat off at the door. It was a small thing, but she noticed. Old Henry Patterson behind the counter looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Mrs. Callahan, I mean, Mrs." he stammered. "Margaret is fine, Henry. I need flour, sugar, and salt. And whatever Mr. Mercer here needs." Henry's eyes shot over to Luke, who stood by the door, quiet and still. "Just some nails," Luke said, his voice calm. "10 penny, 2 pounds." Henry's hands shook as he weighed them out. A sharp voice cut through the quiet store. "Well, well, if it is not the widow and her pet killer." Margaret turned to face Rose Whitfield, the pastor's wife and the town's foremost gossip. "Rose," she said, her voice even. "Nice to see you, is it? Because it looks to me like you have lost your mind marrying that man." Luke did not so much as flinch. "He is more civilized than anyone in this town, Rose, who watched my cattle get slaughtered and did not say a single word." Rose's face pinched up. "That is not fair. Fair is a word for folks who have not been tested." "My husband was a good man," Rose said, "the best sheriff this town ever had, and you replaced him with that." Margaret took one step forward. "That man is my husband now, and his name is Luke Mercer, so I will thank you to use it." Suddenly, the store doors swung open, and a man with a U.S. Marshal's star on his chest walked in. "Mrs. Mercer?" he asked. "My name is Marshal Beck. I need to speak with your husband." Her voice went low and steady. "Daniel died for this town because he believed in every last one of you. The minute he was gone, Victor Crowley came for his land, and not a soul stood between me and that wolf. So do not stand here and lecture me. I made the only choice y'all left me." Rose looked like a fish out of water, mouth opening and closing. "I will pray for you, Margaret. Pray for yourself, Rose. You are the one who has to live with watching and doing nothing." Margaret gathered her things, paid, and walked out into the sun. Luke followed, the flour sack over his shoulder like it was nothing. At the wagon, he loaded the supplies. "You did not need me in there," he said. "Probably not." "Then why bring me?" Margaret took the reins, staring straight ahead. "Because you are my husband. In this town, that means something, whether they like it or not." She snapped the leather, and the wagon lurched on. The silence between them felt different now, thinner. Something you could almost see through. They were halfway home when Luke finally spoke. "My commanding officer was Colonel Briggs." Margaret kept her eyes on the road, not pushing. "He ordered us to clear out an Apache settlement, women and children. Said they were hiding fighters." Luke's voice was flat, empty. "I refused. I told him I did not sign up to kill kids." "And what happened?" "He had me stripped and whipped in front of the whole company. 30 lashes. I passed out around 22. Woke up tied to a wagon wheel. Margaret's hands gripped the reins tighter. Another unit cleared the settlement. I heard the shots from where I was tied." He paused. "I could not stop it." "That is not your fault." "Maybe not, but it is my burden to carry." She let that hang in the dusty air between them. "Is that why you kill?" she asked, her voice simple and honest. "No, ma'am. I kill because some men leave you no other choice. But every time I hear those gunshots, and I wonder if I am any different from the men who fired them." "You are." "How can you know that?" "Because they never lost a wink of sleep over it." "You remind me of him," Luke said, his voice quiet. "Of Daniel. He saw the good in people, things they could not see in themselves." Margaret's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. "He saw something in you," she said. "He saw a man who needed a purpose." A long silence stretched out. "And now I have one." They rode the rest of the way without a word. That night, Margaret was on the porch again when Luke came on his nightly patrol. This time, he just sat down on the other end of the steps. "Luke." "Ma'am?" "My name is Margaret." There was a pause. "Margaret." The way he said it was careful, like the word was fragile. It stirred something deep inside her she had long forgotten. "Thank you," she said, "for what you did not do when Rose was talking. She was not wrong about what I am, about the killing." She was wrong about you. There is a difference between what a man has done and who a man is. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands like an anchor. Daniel used to say that, he said softly. Then maybe it is time you started believing it. He looked at her then, and in the starlight, she saw something raw and terrified in his face. He was afraid of her, not because she was a threat, but because she might be the one thing that could save him, and being saved means changing. Good night, Margaret. Good night, Luke. He stood and walked back into the darkness. She watched him go, thinking, Daniel, what have you sent me? Not just a protector, but a man I might actually learn to trust. Inside, Luke sat on his cot, the memory of her saying his name still echoing. He pulled out the letter and read it again. Look after Maggie. I am trying, Daniel, he whispered to the empty room. I am trying. Outside, in a fine house with oil lamps in every window, Victor Crowley read a report from his men. The marriage seems real. Mercer is armed. The widow is not backing down. Crowley tossed the paper into the fireplace. He picked up his pen and wrote just 2 words. Burn it. The smell woke Margaret first, a thick, wrong smell that filled her lungs. Then her eyes burned, and the orange glow under her door told her everything. Fire. She hit the floor, the boards already hot. She grabbed her robe and reached for the door handle. Searing metal blistered her palm, the pain cutting through the haze. Luke! She screamed. The only answer was the hungry roar of the fire eating her home. The porch was gone, the front wall was going. She crawled low through the black smoke, knowing this house by heart. The back door was stuck. She slammed her shoulder against it again and again, but the wood only groaned. The heat pressed on her back, a terrifying weight. Then glass shattered in the kitchen. Someone was breaking the window from outside. Big, bleeding hands reached through the jagged opening, and Luke's voice cut through the roar. Margaret, take my hands. She could not see him, only feel his iron grip pulling her toward the window. I cannot fit. Tuck your arms. I have got you. He pulled. Glass tore at her clothes and skin, but she was moving, out into the air, into his arms. The air was thick with smoke, but she could still breathe. The next thing she knew, she was on the ground, with Luke's body covering hers as the house behind them tore itself apart. The wood screamed and the roof came down with a terrible crash. Margaret tasted dirt and thought, it is all gone. Everything Daniel and I built is gone. Luke pulled her to her feet. His shirt was smoldering. His arms were blistered and his hands bled from broken glass. Can you walk? He asked. She just nodded. Then we are moving. He put a hand on her back, guiding her away. It was the first time he had touched her since the courthouse, and his hand felt like the only solid thing left in the world. 50 yards out, they stopped to watch the Callahan ranch burn. She saw 9 years of her life with Daniel, every photograph, every memory, turned to nothing but smoke. The tears would not come. Something inside her had turned to hard steel, a voice she did not recognize as her own. Crowley, she said. Luke gave a grim nod. Kerosene. They poured it all along the porch. This was meant to trap us. To kill me, she said. No, this was meant to scare you. If he wanted you dead, the windows would have been blocked too. Margaret's hands were shaking with a rage that started the day they put Daniel in the ground. I'm going to see him. I want to look Victor Crowley right in the eye. Not tonight, Margaret, Luke said. He stepped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat rolling off his burned skin. The fire danced in his eyes. You listen to me. His voice was a low growl, tight with a feeling she had never heard from him before. It was the sound of a good man trying not to do a bad thing. If I go to town and see him tonight, I will kill him. I know I will. And if I do that, he said, everything we have worked for is gone. The marriage, this land, your name, all of it. He burned my home, she whispered, her voice breaking. He burned everything I had left of Daniel. I know, he said softly. And you are telling me to wait? I am telling you that Crowley wants the butcher of Silver Creek to ride into town. He wants me to prove their story's right. I will not give him that. Margaret watched the flames eat her past. Then what do we do? We lived through tonight. Tomorrow we fight smart. After a long moment, she nodded. They walked to the barn where Luke laid out horse blankets in the hay. She sat and watched him tend to his burns, his movements sure and practiced, like he had done it 100 times before. Let me see your hands, she said. I am fine. Luke, let me see them. He hesitated, then showed her his hands. The cuts from the glass were deep, one on his right palm so bad she could see bone. You need stitches for this, Luke. I have had worse. That is not the point, she insisted. She began to clean the wounds gently with a cloth dipped in water. He watched her with a look of pure confusion, as if he had never known a kind touch in his life. You came through a burning window for me, she said quietly. Yes, Margaret. Why not the door? The entire porch was on fire. The window was the only way in. You could have died. I was not thinking about that, he said. What were you thinking about? He was quiet for a second, his fingers twitching in her grasp. I was thinking that I could not fail you and Daniel both. I have failed enough people in my lifetime. She finished wrapping his hand but kept holding it. You did not fail, Luke. I am alive. Your house is gone. A house is wood and nails. I am flesh and blood. And I am still here. He looked like he was about to say he was sorry, but she spoke first. Tell me what you are actually feeling, not what you think you should feel. The honest truth. He pulled his hand from hers, and she watched as the wall he had spent 34 years building came crumbling down. I am scared, he said, the words coming out rough and broken. Not of Crowley. I'm scared I will do something that makes you look at me the way everyone else does. Like I am a monster. His voice cracked. I am scared you will wake up one day and wish you had never trusted me. Margaret, I have killed 11 men, 11 of them, and I carry every single one. She let his confession settle in the quiet barn. Then she moved, closing the 4 feet of distance they had always kept between them. She sat right next to him, shoulder to shoulder, feeling the warmth coming from deep inside him. I will never look at you like that, she said, her voice steady. You do not know that. I know a monster does not run into a fire for someone else. A monster does not feel the weight of the men he has killed. And a monster does not admit when he is scared. She turned to face him fully. You are not what they call you, Luke Mercer. You are what you choose to be. And tonight, you chose me. He looked at her, and she kissed him. It was not a gentle or questioning kiss. It was a kiss that left no room for any doubt. With nothing left to lose, she kissed him. It was a kiss full of fire and fury. Her whole self poured into it. For a long second, he was still as a stone, and Margaret thought she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She thought she had read it all wrong. But then he kissed her back. His bandaged hands gently held her face steady, like he was holding something precious he had been searching for his whole life. The wall between them just vanished, like it was never there at all. She pulled away, her forehead resting on his. I did not plan on that, she breathed. I know, and I am not sorry. She looked him square in the eye. I am going to need you tomorrow. The real you, not the butcher the world sees. What is happening tomorrow? His eyes searched hers. Tomorrow, he said. We fight. He gave a single firm nod. Together. They sat in the barn and watched the house burn down to nothing. He put an arm around her, a little clumsy, like a man remembering a kindness he had long forgotten. As the fire died out, she heard him whisper, I do not deserve this. She did not argue. She just leaned in closer and said, "Neither did I. But here we are." The sun came up red and mean. Margaret stood before the ruins of her home and took stock of what she still had. The barn, 60 head of cattle, and a husband with a reputation and a good heart. And she had rage, plenty of it. Luke was already by the horses, armed not with a gun but with papers, land surveys, receipts, tax records. "Where did you get these?" she asked. "From the territorial office. Crowley's name is on 12 land deals. Each one happened after a fire or poisoned water. It is a pattern." "I've been gathering these for a while," Luke admitted. "Daniel sent me a second letter." He pulled a worn envelope from his coat. Margaret opened it and saw Daniel's familiar handwriting. The letter was plain. It said Crowley was crooked and the proof was in a floor safe under the kitchen. The combination was her birthday. "Don't let him take the land," it read. "Don't let him take her." Margaret's hands trembled as she looked at the smoldering wreckage. "The safe is iron," Luke said. "It probably made it." He got her boots from the barn first, telling her, "You will burn your feet off." They dug through the ash and found it. Margaret knelt and dialed her birthday, March 17th, 1952. The lock clicked open. Inside was a leather folder, singed but whole. It was full of forged land documents and bank statements showing payments from Crowley to Judge Hawthorne. There was also a statement from a man who saw Crowley's men setting a fire. "Daniel knew," Margaret whispered. "He was building a case." Luke's jaw was tight, and somebody made sure he did not finish it. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice small. "I mean, your husband was supposedly shot by a drifter who was never caught," Luke said. "I mean, nobody looked very hard for him, and I think Victor Crowley had every reason to want Daniel Callahan dead." The truth hit her like a punch to the gut. No, it could not be. But Luke's voice was steady. "Nothing about Crowley is random." She clutched the folder to her chest. "You think he killed my husband?" "I think he paid to have it done," Luke replied. "And I think the proof is in your hands." A fire of grief and rage, 6 months old, finally erupted inside her. "Then we end this," she declared. "We ride into town and burn Victor Crowley to the ground." "Not the town," Luke said calmly. "Crowley owns the town. We need to go over his head to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. That is a 3-day ride. We do not have to ride there. We just need to send a message. There is a telegraph office in Hayden, 20 miles east. Crowley does not own Hayden." She stared at him, this broken man who stood in the ashes of her life, and offered a way forward that did not involve more killing. "You planned for this." "I planned for him to push," he said. "I just did not think he would push this hard. But I promised Daniel I would protect you." She held the folder tight. "Then let us ride." They saddled the horses. Margaret changed into a pair of Daniel's old trousers and a work shirt she found in the barn. She tucked the folder inside her shirt. Luke loaded his revolver. "I thought you said no bullets," she said. "I said I would not start it," he answered. "I did not say I would not finish it." They rode east, hard and fast. The sun beat down on the open prairie with nowhere to hide. 3 miles out, she heard horses behind them. "Luke," she said, looking back at the rising dust cloud. "Crowley's men," he said without turning. "What do we do?" He kept his pace steady. "Trust me." Margaret's hand instinctively went to the folder against her chest. The hoofbeats grew louder, a drumming that sounded like doom. Margaret Callahan, a widow and a rancher, leaned low over her saddle and spurred her horse on. The first bullet whizzed past her ear, so close she felt the heat. Her horse shied, and Luke reached out, grabbing her bridle to steady the animal. "Stay low," he yelled. "Do not stop." Another shot hit the dirt beside her. She pressed herself against her horse, the folder a hard square against her ribs. It was Daniel's last fight, the only weapon she had. The third shot was not a warning. It tore through the back of her saddle, the impact jolting her straight up. In one smooth motion, Luke turned and fired his revolver. He did not aim to kill. The lead rider's hat flew off his head, a message clear as day. Crowley's men pulled up short, cursing in a cloud of dust. Luke holstered his pistol and spurred his horse on. "Ride," he commanded, "now, while they are thinking it over." They rode without stopping until the town of Hayden was in sight. When Margaret slid from her horse, her legs gave out from under her. Luke caught her, holding her steady. "I am all right," she managed to say. "You are not," he replied gently, "but you will be." He stood watching the road they had come down. "That last shot," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "The one that hit my saddle, that was not wide." Luke's voice was grim. "No, they could have killed me." He looked at her then. "They will not get another chance." "Let's send that wire," she said. In the town of Hayden, the telegraph operator was a thin man named Cecil. He looked at Luke like a rabbit staring at a coyote. "I need to send a priority message to the United States Marshal's office in Cheyenne," Margaret announced. Cecil stammered, "That is a government line, ma'am. That costs double." "Then charge me double," she replied. She spoke the message plainly, just as Daniel had taught her. It accused Victor Crowley of land fraud, arson, and corruption in Red Hollow, and requested an immediate investigation. She signed it Margaret Callahan Mercer, widow of Sheriff Daniel Callahan. Cecil's hand paused. "You are Daniel Callahan's widow?" "I am." "I knew Daniel. He was a good, honest man. I am very sorry for your trouble." He looked at the message again. "This is dangerous." "I know." Cecil thought for a long moment, then pulled a second form from a drawer and began to copy her message. "What are you doing?" Luke asked Seal at the telegraph office. "Sending a copy to the federal marshals in Denver just in case. Crowley has spies in Cheyenne, but not in Denver," Seal said, his fingers tapping the key. Margaret felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost buckled her knees. "Thank you, Seal. Don't thank me until they arrest that son of a—" He stopped. "Pardon me, ma'am. I have heard worse." Seal handed her a receipt. "Cheyenne usually takes 48 hours. Denver might be quicker." "We do not have 48 hours," Luke said. "Then find a safe place to hide. Because if Crowley learns you sent this, he will not send a fire next time." Margaret tucked the papers close. "We are going back to Red Hollow." Luke stared at her. "That is not safe. My land is there. My cattle are there. I am not hiding while Crowley finishes what he started. I am going back. You can come with me or you can stay here. But I am going back." Luke watched her hard for a good 3 seconds, then settled his hat on his head. "I am going with you." The ride back to Red Hollow was slower, the July sun beating down on the Wyoming territory. It was the kind of heat that seeps into your bones. Margaret's lips were cracked and her burned hand ached something fierce. She could feel the blood seeping through Daniel's old trousers from where she got cut the night before. But she never said a word, just kept her eyes forward. Luke rode beside her, scanning the horizon. The riders they saw that morning were long gone. "They will find out," Margaret said, talking about the telegram. "Cecil will keep his mouth shut, but word gets around in a town like Hayden." "So what is the plan when we get back? We make Crowley come to us on our land, or what is left of it. The barn is still there," he said. "The well is good, and the cattle are all right." He looked over at her. "And you are alive. That is the only thing that matters." "You keep saying that," she replied, almost smiling. "You say it because you need to remember it." The smile never quite reached her eyes, but he saw her try. It softened something in the hard-edged man. They got to Red Hollow as the sun was setting, and the town felt different. Margaret knew it the second they hit Main Street. Folks were peeking out of windows and from shadowed doorways. It was not the mean looks they usually got. This was something else, something shaky. It was fear, not of Luke, but of what was coming for all of them. Old man Patterson came out of his general store and gave them a short, quick nod. It was the kind of nod a man gives when he is picked aside but is not ready to shout about it. Dr. Whitaker was on his porch and saw Margaret's burns and bloody clothes right away. "Mrs. Callahan, you need a doctor's care." "I need a whole list of things, Doc." "A doctor is about third on that list." "What is first?" "Justice. Second is a drink of water. If you have some water, I will take that now and worry about justice tomorrow." Dr. Whitaker brought out 2 canteens. Margaret drank one down, and Luke finished the other. "I rode out and saw your house this morning," the doctor said softly. "That fire was no accident, Margaret. Anyone can see it was set." "I know who did it," she said. "The whole town knows. The real question is, who is brave enough to say it out loud?" She looked him right in the eye. "Are you?" The old doctor, a man who had brought half the town into the world, rubbed his gray-bearded jaw. "Daniel was my best friend," he said at last, "and I have acted like a coward since he died. I kept my mouth shut when Crowley cheated the Dawsons out of their ranch. I did nothing when he ran the Miller family off. I told myself it was not my fight." He stood up a little straighter. "Well, it is my fight now. What made you change your mind?" "He tried to burn you alive in your own home, Margaret. That is not business. That is plain murder." Then Dr. Whitaker turned to Luke. "Mr. Mercer, I owe you an apology. I believed all those stories they told about you." "Most of them are true," Luke said. "Word got around fast." That night, 3 more folks showed up at the barn, which was the only thing Margaret had left. Sarah Brennan, a widow whose husband's store burned down mysteriously before Crowley bought it for cheap. Tom Harding, a rancher who lost his water rights. And, to Margaret's surprise, Rose Whitfield, the pastor's wife. The self-righteous look she always wore was gone, replaced by shame. "I came here to apologize," Rose said quietly. "I stood in that store and called your husband a bad man, while the real villain was buying my silence with donations to our church. Victor Crowley gave us $600 last year. I knew where that money came from, but I did not care more about my church than my own neighbor." Margaret took her hands. "Then help me now." "How?" "Be a witness. When the marshal gets here, you tell him everything you know." Rose's eyes went wide. "But those were private talks. He burned my house, Rose. He might have killed my husband. There is no such thing as private anymore." Rose nodded like she was finally ready to do the right thing. "I will testify." They came one by one after that, like a trickle of water that starts a river. By sunrise, Margaret had 7 sworn statements and Dr. Whitaker's medical report on her injuries. Luke laid out all the proof, organizing it with Daniel's papers. He knew the most powerful weapon was not a gun, but a piece of paper with the right words on it. Margaret watched him, feeling a deep sense of pride. "Luke," she said, "when this is all over, what happens with us?" He put his pen down. "What do you want to happen?" "I asked you first." He turned to her, and for the first time she saw real hope in his eyes. "I want to stay," he said, "if you will have me. Not because of the law or Daniel's letter, but because of you. You are the first person who ever really looked at me and did not run away. You kissed me while your house was burning, and you tasted like smoke and anger and something I want to figure out for the rest of my life." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, and for the first time since Daniel died, she let them fall. "I choose you," she whispered, "not because Daniel sent you, but because you ran into that fire for me, because you sit way over on the edge of the porch like you are afraid of taking up too much space. And Luke Mercer, I need you to stop sitting so far away." He crossed the barn in 3 long strides and held her face in his hands. "I will rebuild your house," he said. "Our house. Our house." He kissed her then, not with the fire from the night before, but with a softness that promised he was here to stay. On the 3rd day, Marshal Thomas Beck rode into Red Hollow with 4 deputies. The sound of their horses on Main Street made the whole town go silent. Doors closed and curtains were drawn. Beck was a tall man who had seen too much trouble in his life. He swung down from his horse in front of what was left of the Callahan ranch. "Mrs. Callahan, the land still carries my first husband's name." Beck nodded. "Ma'am, I got your telegram, and 6 others forwarded by a Mr. Cecil Watts. He seems mighty keen on seeing justice done." Margaret almost smiled. "I have evidence," she said, handing him Daniel's folder. "My husband, Sheriff Daniel Callahan, was investigating Victor Crowley for land fraud, bribery, and arson before he died. And I believe Crowley had him murdered." Beck's jaw tightened as he read through the papers. "Your husband was a good lawman. The best. I have 7 sworn statements," she added, "and medical proof of what he did to me." Beck closed the folder and looked at Luke. "And you must be Luke Mercer." "Yes, sir. The butcher of Silver Creek." Luke did not even blink. "That is what some folks call me." "I know what they call you," the marshal said. "I also know what the governor's pardon says. The men you killed back in Silver Creek were on a federal wanted list, Mr. Mercer." Marshal Beck extended a hand. "You did our office a service." Luke shook his hand but said nothing. Beck turned to his deputies. "Ride out to the Crowley ranch. Serve this warrant." An hour later, Victor Crowley rode into town alone. "This is a mistake, Marshal," he boomed. "This woman is a grieving widow being manipulated by a killer." "Mr. Crowley," Beck said, "you are under arrest for land fraud, arson, and conspiracy to commit murder." "Murder?" Crowley scoffed. "That is absurd." "We have Judge Hawthorne's records," Beck said calmly. "He has been very cooperative. He named you as the man who paid to have Sheriff Daniel Callahan killed." The street went dead silent. And in that quiet, Margaret finally understood the real reason the wolves had come for her land. A physical one. The thing she had suspected was now a fact. Victor Crowley had her husband murdered. Her voice was steady when she faced the man who'd taken everything. "You killed him." A flicker of something crossed Crowley's face. He was in the way. The casual way he said it hit Margaret harder than a fist. "He was my husband. He was the best man in this town. And you killed him because he was in your way. A railroad ain't worth a man's life, and you will spend the rest of yours learning that." Crowley's hand twitched toward his coat. "Don't," Luke said. The word was quiet, but it landed like a hammer blow. Crowley's hand froze. "I wouldn't," Luke added. "Not today, not in front of her." Crowley looked at Luke, at the scars, at the resolve in his eyes, and saw a man holding back. "You're a killer," Crowley spat. "I was," Luke replied. "That woman showed me there is something tougher than taking a life. It is choosing not to." As the deputies put Crowley on a horse, he turned one last time to Margaret. He sneered, "Your husband was a fool, and you just married another one." But Margaret stepped forward, her voice like steel forged in sunlight and 6 months of sorrow. "My husband was a hero," she said loud and clear for the whole town to hear. "And the man I married is the bravest soul in this territory. You will not speak of them, not now, not ever." Crowley just stared as they led him away. The street was dead silent. Then slowly folks started coming out of their homes. Hats were tipped. Old Henry Patterson crossed the road and shook Luke's hand. And Margaret Callahan, a widow no longer defined by her loss, felt a forgotten feeling settle over her. It was not victory. It was justice, the kind that honors what was taken from you. Sleep did not come for Margaret that night, but for once, it was not from grief. A restless new feeling was stirring inside her. She sat in the barn, her only home now, and held Daniel's folder. For the first time, she saw the note he had written on the inside cover. Her heart clenched as she read his familiar script. "Maggie, if you are reading this, I am gone. I am so sorry. I thought I could fix this mess alone. I was wrong. You were always the stronger one." She pressed the paper to her lips and whispered to the empty barn, "I proved it, Daniel. I hope you saw." At dawn, Luke was standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "Marshal Beck wants to see us," he said softly. "Both of us. Down at the town hall. Right now." Margaret stood up, still wearing Daniel's trousers and his shirt. It was the only piece of him she had left. "Are you all right?" Luke asked. She looked at the fresh scars on his arms and the bandages she had wrapped around his hands. "I do not know what I am," she answered honestly. "But I am standing. And for now, that is enough." They rode into town together. But this time was different. No one turned away. No one whispered behind their hands. Instead, Henry Patterson waved from his store. Dr. Whitaker tipped his hat. A young mother Margaret hardly knew nodded and said, "Morning, Mrs. Callahan. God bless you." Her throat tightened. The town hall was full to bursting. Every rancher, every shopkeeper, every family in Red Hollow was packed inside, and the air smelled of dust, sweat, and something she finally recognized: hope. You could feel the shame hanging heavy in the air, the kind that settles on a town that watched a good woman suffer and did nothing at all. It was a weight that wouldn't lift until someone finally spoke the truth out loud. Up at the front stood Marshal Beck, and beside him was a thin man in a suit too clean for this part of the country. Beck started, "Mr. Mercer, appreciate you coming." Margaret sat right in the front row. Luke stood just behind her, a solid, silent presence. "I'll get straight to it," Beck said. "Victor Crowley has given a full confession. To avoid the rope, he's detailed every crooked land deal, every fire, every bribe." Beck paused, and his voice dropped low. "And he confessed to hiring a man named Jonas Pike to murder Sheriff Daniel Callahan." A gasp went through the room. Some folks already suspected, but hearing it said official like that, well, it turned rumor into solid fact. Margaret didn't make a sound. She'd already cried all her tears over this. All she had left for the shock was silence. "Jonas Pike," she said, her voice steady. "Where is he?" "Dead. Killed in a bar fight in Deadwood 4 months back. So he won't face a trial for the murder itself, but Crowley will face conspiracy charges," Beck continued. "So no one truly answers for my Daniel's death." Beck met her gaze. "Crowley will spend the rest of his days in a federal prison. I know it ain't the same." "No," Margaret said flatly. "It is not." Her voice was hard, the sound of a woman who'd learned justice wasn't a hot meal, but a sip of water when you're dying of thirst. It keeps you going, but it sure don't make you full. "However," Beck went on, "there is another matter." He motioned to the fella in the suit. "This is Arthur Wynne, the Territorial Land Commissioner." Wynne stepped forward, holding a document like it was precious. "Mrs. Callahan, the government has reviewed all the fraudulent land transfers from Mr. Crowley. 14 properties were taken illegally. 7 families were run off their land." He paused. "I understand the governor has issued an order. All that land will be returned to the rightful owners. There will also be funds from Crowley's seized assets for rebuilding." Margaret just stared. "You're saying I get my land back?" "Ma'am," Wynne said gently, "the land was always yours. The law just had some catching up to do." That broke something inside her. Not in a bad way, but like a fist finally unclenching after a long, hard fight. She felt Luke's hand come to rest on her shoulder, a light touch asking for permission, and she reached up to cover it with her own. "There is more," Wynne said, opening the paper. "The guardianship law that forced you to remarry, the one that started all this, has been flagged for review by the legislature. Your case, Mrs. Callahan, is the reason why." "Flagged for review isn't getting rid of it," she said. "No, but it is a start. A start." Margaret stood up then, looking at all the faces that had watched her, judged her, and done nothing. "A start would have been one of you speaking up 6 months ago. A start would have been somebody asking what I needed instead of what I was going to give up." The room was dead quiet. "I don't blame y'all," she said, her voice softening just a bit. "Not anymore. Crowley made cowards of all of us. I was too proud to ask for help, and you were too scared to offer it. And a good man died because none of us was brave enough to stand between the wolf and the flock like he did." She let her words sink in. But I am asking now, not for me. For every woman in this territory who is one dead husband away from losing it all. Her voice grew stronger, filling the room. This law needs to change. Not be reviewed. Changed. And I'm fixin' to be the one who changes it. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Rose Whitfield stood up. She did not say a word. She just stood. Then Sarah Brennan got to her feet, then Tom Harding, and soon the whole room was standing. 30 people finding their feet in a town that had been on its knees for too long. Margaret looked at them and finally understood what Daniel had always believed. People were good. The law was only as strong as the folks willing to fight for it. She had thought he was a dreamer. Turns out he was right all along. Marshal Beck cleared his throat. Mrs. Callahan, I will personally see your petition gets to the governor. And for what it's worth, he tipped his hat, your husband would be mighty proud. I know, Margaret said. He always was. Outside, Luke waited by the wagon, patient as ever. He watched her say her goodbyes, taking up only the space she had allowed him. When she finally walked over, she leaned against the wagon beside him. You know what Daniel would say right now? She asked. What? He'd say, Maggie, you just gave a speech to 30 people while wearing your husband's old trousers. You might want to buy a dress. And then it happened. Luke laughed. Not a chuckle, but a real honest-to-goodness laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. It changed his whole face, made him look younger, like the man he must have been before the world took its toll on him. That is the first time I have heard you do that, she said, her voice soft. It is the first time I have done that in a long time. How long? He gave it some thought. Before the war. That is too long. I know. She nudged his shoulder with hers. Well, consider yourself warned. I am going to make it my mission to fix that. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence now, the kind that comes after the hard things have been said and survived. The barn was still standing, the cattle were grazing, and by the fence post nearest the road, someone had left a bundle. Margaret climbed down and unwrapped it. Inside was a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a beautiful quilt, and a note. From your neighbors. We should have done this months ago. Margaret held the quilt to her chest and let 2 tears fall. Just 2. Then she wiped her face and carried the gifts inside. She found Luke already working. He had pulled old lumber from the hay shed and was measuring and cutting. What are you doing? Margaret asked. Starting the house. Luke, we do not have enough for a whole house. We have got enough for a floor, he said, looking at her. And a floor is a start. She watched him for a moment. He worked like he did everything else, steady and careful, as if building something new could mend what was broken in his past. Luke, she said. He looked up. I want to show you something. She led him to the quiet spot behind the barn, to the place where Daniel was buried. At Daniel's grave, marked by a wooden cross she had carved, Margaret knelt in the dirt. It is over, Daniel, she said. We got him. The whole town stood up and your fight is finished. She paused, taking a steadying breath. I need to tell you about Luke. You were right to trust him. He's a good man, better than he knows. And I love him, Daniel. Not like I loved you. Nothing will ever be like that. But this is real and true, and I hope you would want that for me. When she stood, Luke was looking at her, his face completely open and raw. Did you mean it? He asked, his voice rough. What you said about loving me. I do not say things I do not mean, Luke. Not anymore. You have known me 3 weeks. I have known you much longer. I knew you the moment you walked into that courthouse and stood up for a dead man's memory. To marry a stranger just because a dead man said so. I knew you when you mended my fences without me asking. I knew you when you pulled me from that fire with your bare hands. I do not need years, Luke. I just need truth, and you have given me plenty. He fidgeted, a thing she had never seen. This man who faced down riders without a blink was nervous. I do not know how to be a husband, he said quietly. A real one. Margaret took his scarred hand in hers. "You learn," she said. "Same way I learned to run this ranch. You just do it. When you get it wrong, you try again." "What if I hurt you?" he asked. "You will not. I know that because the men who do harm never worry about it. That you are even asking is the only answer I need." She watched as it seemed a great weight lifted off the man who had carried so much for so long. "All right," he finally breathed. "I will learn." He looked her in the eye. "But Margaret, there is one thing you need to know. I love you. Not because of any promise and not because of the law. I love you because when I am with you, all the ghosts go quiet inside my head. I have been looking for that quiet my entire life." The kiss that followed was not about passion. It was a promise. It said, "I am here. I am choosing you for all our days to come." 3 months on, the house stood new and larger, with 2 bedrooms instead of 1. She was expecting a secret she was sure he already knew. She sat on the porch that Luke and a dozen neighbors had built, looking out at the land that was finally hers, the deed in her name alone. No guardian required. Her speech in Cheyenne in front of 14 lawmakers had seen to that, repealing the old law for good. The women who came from all over Wyoming to watch her that day made sure of it. He had called her beautiful that day in her blue cotton dress. She had called him terrified. He was, he admitted, but not of the lawmakers. He was scared of the 50 women in the gallery looking at him like a hero. "I am no hero," he insisted. When she listed all he had done, he just shrugged and called it a Tuesday. She had laughed, and he had given a real smile that reached his eyes. Now, a letter from the governor calling him a man of honor sat folded in his coat. He kept it with the things that mattered. She sat on the porch listening to him hammer inside, pretending it was a shelf. But she had already seen the pine wood cradle he was building in the barn, the one with tiny horses carved right into it. She knew he must have guessed her secret. Luke noticed everything. She called him to the porch, and he sat down close beside her. There was no space left between them. Taking his hand, she traced the fine white scars. "I have something to tell you." A small smile touched his lips. "I know." He looked at her. "Margaret, I have tracked men across 3 territories. Did you think I would not notice you giving up coffee and getting summer allergies in July?" She laughed then, a sound that was a little broken but beautiful. He pulled her close. "Are you scared?" she whispered. "Terrified," he admitted. "Good. Me too," she said. "I know nothing about babies." "You are doing just fine as a husband," she reassured him. He was quiet a moment. Daniel would have been a good father. Her heart ached with a sweet sadness to hear him honor the man who brought them together. "He would have," she said. "And so will you." "How do you know?" "Because good fathers are good men who show up. And you, Luke Mercer, you always show up." He kissed her hair. "I will build a bigger porch," he said. "A child will need room to run." She leaned into his chest, feeling the steady beat of a man who had walked through fire and found he was capable of love. The prairie was not empty anymore. It was full of life, full of the sound of a steady hammer, a man's breathing next to her, and a new heart beating inside her. This was a future she had earned. In a land where women were property and men were judged by blood, Margaret Callahan kept her name, her land, and loved a man the world told her to fear. And Luke Mercer, known only for the graves he had filled, chose to be a husband and a father. He chose to build things instead of breaking them. And the world they built together burned bright with a new dawn.